So we are going to go ahead and get to it. In the meantime, as folks are still joining us, we have folks in the chat box letting us know what their name and role is and their relationship with data. So we're looking forward to kind of looking at that information as we go. 1 second, I just lost my little screen. All right. So if you want to go on ahead, Jane. Right. We are here. Oh, back one, Jane, please. All right, folks. Thank you. We are here to talk about going deeper on all singles data. Really excited to be speaking with you all this afternoon about this topic because it is something that I think myself and a lot of the folks on the Built for Zero team, especially the data team, have been thinking a lot about over the past couple of months. So as we get into some introductions, Jane, if you want to. I am Lauren D'Amico. I'm the strategy lead for our data coaching and capacity building team here in the Built for Zero data team. I'm going to do our introductions together. I have the distinct honor of also introducing my good friend and colleague, Jane Moy, who is our data coach and performance advisor. And part of why I'm doing the introduction for us is Jane and I have been with the Built for Zero team for myself for about 2 years, almost 2 years, and Jane for a year. However, prior to working with the Built for Zero data team, Jane and I both actually met a few years back while working in Jacksonville. Jacksonville is one of the Built for Zero communities who have been with the movement for a really long time, really from the beginning. And I joined that community sometime around 2013 and took on the role of doing their coordinated entry implementation. As I was working on that, I actually also acquired the HMIS administrator role. So I played a really integral part in helping the community establish our data infrastructure and our coordinated entry process and our by name list process. And myself and with another colleague, Charles Temple, who I'm sure is on this call, we really started exploring ways in which we were going to kind of manage our by name list data. Jane joined our team in Jacksonville as an HMIS data analyst about 2 years after Chaz and I had been working on a lot of this work. And she was really one of the game changers. She kind of helped us unlock HMIS and brought our by name list to the next level. So I'm really excited to do this presentation with her because for us, it does feel like a little bit of a full circle moment. You know, I spent a lot of years working with Jacksonville in that local context and spent a lot of years working with them on our Built for Zero improvement plans and measuring our progress and hopefully reaching our goals. So to be in this moment with you all is really special for me as well. But we're not alone in this. I wanted to take a moment and just level set. You know, Jane and I are part of a team. We're a small but a really mighty team. We're consisted of two sort of sub-profile teams. So we have our data solutions team, and they really are the team that's, you know, diagnosing and thinking about data solutions that make sense and that help streamline the process. So some of the things and areas where their work shows up is the scorecard and any infrastructure improvements. They're really doing a lot of work about thinking about tech-enabled aggregation tools. They really are putting together our racial equity framework and the support tools that go along with it, because that's such critical pieces of the puzzle right now and critical tools that are going to help advance our work even further. And then we have the Clear the Path team. And we're really the community facing team. We provide a lot of the implementation support, one-to-one data coaching will show up a lot in your interventions as data supports as you work over the next couple months with your different cohorts that you've been a part of. We focus on skill building, capacity building, and looking at future pass-through funding opportunities. We have a course then led by our fearless leader, Aras, who is our portfolio lead and really sets the direction and the tone for the work that the Built for Zero team does, or the Built for Zero data team does. All right, so for today, I wanted to set just some basic objectives and give you all a better sense of how we're gonna spend our time together. So we really want to dive into understanding why we're widening our population focus and really explore what it takes from going from that quality subpopulation level data to reporting quality data for all singles. We're going to lay the foundation for communities to gain line of sight into their system-wide data by starting with that all singles work to really work on identifying those unique paths to ending homelessness for all. We'll talk a little bit about different approaches to collecting and managing that data from existing data sources so that you can start building your by-nameless data sets with a bit more confidence. During our time together, some of our commitments to you all, talking about data infrastructure in the context of expanding to all singles is a really big subject. And we've packed a lot into this opportunity that focuses in on the data. So with that, we're inviting you to actually take off your action-oriented hats for a little bit and just take this opportunity as an opportunity just to let that information sink in. The session's is designed to generate more questions than answers, and we likely won't get to answer a lot of the questions that you all have today. And it's okay. This is really where we are in the moment, and we're going to move forward together to work on answering those questions as a movement. There's a lot of people on this call and it's really exciting. So with that as a consideration, one of the things that Jane and I needed to keep in the back of our minds is presenting this information in a way that feels right for everyone. So it's going to feel different. For some of you that are just starting off, there's going to be points that feel really overwhelming. For those that are leading the way and trailblazing paths forward with the work that they're doing with your data in your local communities, some of this may feel like a refresher, but it's good to have us all together, all talking about this, because this is really a moment to focus in on the important pieces, and that's the data. So to start, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just doing some level setting and really just take an opportunity to do a little bit of a refresh. We're going to talk about the scorecard itself. We're going to talk about our reporting universes, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jane and talk about what happens with the data after it gets reported into our system. So one of the favorite moments so far for me from the learning session really started right from the start. It was Jake's keynote opening, that reflection, that time of thinking back to all these moments that a lot of us, there's many of us on this call that have been through all those moments together over the tenure of our careers. And just really a great way to sort of set the tone for this week of big picture thinking, this week of big picture, examination, and really understanding what it takes for us to move together in this moment and take advantage of the opportunities that are being presented to us. So when thinking about that, one of the things that I just want to name is when we talk about expanding data sets, when we talk about data infrastructure work, that work is really hard and it is a big undertaking. And it's also really important to take the time to do that work. I think with the all singles adult homeless population, one of the benefits is it's going to help us map out successful pathways for building inclusive, representative, real-time by-nameless data sets that are going to help us move the needle and continue to move that needle. If we zoom out for just a couple minutes and think about the overview of the transition that we went from the subpopulation scorecards to this all singles by nameless scorecard, it's really reflective of the journey that we've gone through as a movement. And when you think about the way that data analysis is conducted, it really kind of starts with that end state. It's about trying to understand what it is you want to find out. What's the question that I need to answer? And what you need to take time to consider is, if you're not able to answer the question that you want and would like to be able to answer that, you have to make improvements to your data collection processes and to your data sets that allow you to expand and start sketching out the answers to that. And as Beth reminded us on yesterday's call, a lot of the work that Built for Zero and the movement has done so far has been a result of those moments of failing forward, and those moments of really evaluating and looking at the data that we had available, and also uncovering the data that we didn't know. So when we think about these scorecards, what really happened with them is we took the veteran and the chronic coordinated entry builder scorecards and expanded them. We looked at those questions and realized, hey, we're missing bits and pieces. So we designed it and redesigned it to be a more comprehensive and robust by name list data assessment that's more reflective of your community's progress in producing homeless reductions. I think it's also helpful to sort of reframe the scorecard as an assessment tool. It really is an opportunity to do a deep analysis and an evaluation of your system and create a system improvement map from there. It gets more specific about the participation and coverage. It gets more specific about policies and procedures. It gets very specific about your by name list data sets functional ability. And these are all critical pieces for us to be able to improve upon our quality improvement cycles and to really identify where we can use our data to help support the improvement work that we want to drive forward. Okay, so thinking high level again, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes here on talking about the Built for Zero reporting universe. And this is sort of a review for a lot of us, for those newer communities that have just joined the work, or if you're new to your community's work in a new role, and this is the first time you're seeing this, know that as we move forward, especially through the cohort interventions, especially over the next couple of months, the data coaching support team is here to help you guys process through some of this. We're here to help you think through some of these barriers and challenges to accessing this data. But for the sake of simplicity, if we think about the universe of reporting that Built for Zero is focusing on, sort of lumps into three main population buckets. So we have our all single adults, our families, and our youth. Within the all single adults population bucket, there's actually three subpopulation profiles. We have our veterans, our chronic homeless, and our non-veterans, non-chronic homeless subpopulations. When you put those three subpopulation profiles together with the families and the youth, that's where we get the 5 populations that we have communities work towards building by name lists for and reporting that data. And I want to offer some clarifications here because I think these are some of the common questions that we get. It relates more to families, so I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to keep our focus on the all singles. But because we have an opportunity here for families, when we're talking about our veteran family households or our chronic family households, those populations should be included in your family subset. When we're talking about the all single adults, we're really focusing on all single adult individuals age 25 and up, or adult only households. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get deeper into the presentation, but I just really wanted to draw that distinct clarification there. Once you have the ability to start building out your by name list data sets for each of these populations, the end goal, where we want to get to, is being able to report these following metrics. So we want to start with a high level view of your actively homeless number. Your actively homeless number is reported as of the last day of your reporting month. So for example, April data was just due to the community's performance management trackers by May 15th. So as of the last day, communities were reporting their actively homeless. As of April 30th, communities were reporting their actively homeless populations for the various populations that they're currently tracking. As you move into a more robust system, you should be able to track your inflow and your outflow categories. So for your inflow categories, we have this broken out into 3 buckets. It's your newly identified. So those are who are new to your system or new to your list. So technically it's their first time on the list. Those that are returning from housing. So they have been previously on the list. You were tracking them, they made it into a housing placement, and now unfortunately are returning to homelessness. And then finally, those that are returning from your inactive list. So these are individuals that were on the list, you were tracking them, and for whatever reason, they disengaged with the system and went inactive as per your community's inactive policy. On the flip side, you have your housing placement or your outflow. So in this category, you have housing placements as a bucket. You have those that have moved to inactive. This is going to be outlined by your community's specific inactive policy. A lot of communities use the threshold of 90 days. So meaning that if a person is on your list and they have lost contact with the system, you track them for a period of 90 days. And if they have not re-engaged, you would want to take them out of your actively homeless number and report them as an inactive for the time being. The last bucket here is no longer meets population criteria. And this is really the critical bucket that tracks those population status changes. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that specifically, so I'm not going to dive in here, but I just wanted to highlight, like, this is the end state. This is where we're pushing communities to get to as they work to build their by name lists. However, I want to note that not all communities are going to be able to get all these metrics on the first try, and that's okay. We want to work with you to start reporting with what you have. If all you can get is the actively homeless number, that's fantastic. That's a data point that you're able to access. We'll work with that and build from there. All right, so what do we do with the data once we have it collected? I'm going to actually hand it over to Jane for a little bit now to help us understand how we can use that data to help track some of our changes here.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I think once communities are able to pull the information out of their systems to get those reporting metrics, I think our goal is to try and get them to get to quality data, right? And there's 2 main components, and this is review for many of you guys to get to quality data, but there's a qualitative side and a quantitative side. And so the qualitative side is that scorecard that Lauren referenced earlier. And that qualitative side is getting to reliable data where we calculate a data reliability percentage to try and get under. Okay, and so understanding the whole goal of quality data, we want it to make sure, and this is probably a review for many of you guys, but the whole goal is that your list can demonstrate full coverage of your system, right? You can be able to track people as they come in and out of your system, and be able to have it be reliable. So can you account for everybody as they come in and out of your system in those inflow and outflow metrics in your actively homeless number, and that it's regularly updated. So it's in as real time as possible. So if you were to look at the information on your list, you could say, I know where this person is right now. And I think our end goal with this is that we want you to be able to have confidence in your data to start looking and using it for improvement, right? So once you have a confidence in your data, you can actually start to see what certain norms are in your system. But before getting to that level of confidence, how would you know if that is a system norm, or it's just an anomaly, or maybe there's a data cleanup going on? So that's why we want to get to that quality data piece. So obviously getting to set those improvement medians to understand what those norms are in your system. And with those, you're able to track if there's data points that fall below or above, you can start to identify, is something significant really happening in your system that signals, yes, something, maybe an improvement project that we're working on, that's really driving numbers down. So that's another example. And then being able to disaggregate it in terms of other ways, right? So if you wanted to zero in on inflow numbers and outflow numbers, or looking at specifically housing placements, or maybe you're looking at returns from inactive or returns from housing, just understanding and being able to just aggregate some of those numbers more will give you a lot of information to like dive into to understand the ins and outs of your system. So obviously that is the end goal of our monthly reporting. So we wanted to take a step back and just frame out the difference between quality data and reliability. And so I'm going back into high school science and talking about experiments as they are accurate versus precise, but I think it's a great analogy when talking about data that's both good quality but also reliable. So your system, when you first started out, right, you might have had data points all over the place, right? So maybe your process of pulling it out of the system, cleaning it, etc., that wasn't quite like tight enough, and maybe your data isn't complete enough, right? Maybe not all providers are contributing to your system. Maybe you're missing people to count that are experiencing homelessness, right? So you can have a situation where you're very precise, but also not accurate. And that bullseye is that analogy of your data is both comprehensive and it's easy to pull, like it's consistently pulled over time. So that precise but not accurate example, maybe you have a very efficient way of getting it out of your system. You have very robust reporting logic, cleaning steps, etc. And you know exactly what programs to pull from to get that information out of your system, but maybe you're still missing people, right? So maybe there's an emergency shelter that's not inputting into your system. And so there's a big gap in completeness. On the other hand, you could have something that's very accurate, but it's not precise, right? So you have high confidence that your list is comprehensive. You have captured pretty much everyone that is actively homeless in your system, but you're still refining your process for accounting for everyone month to month. And then finally, the goal is to be both accurate and precise, right? So you have a very efficient process to pull and clean your data. It's consistent, the reporting logic makes sense, you're not missing anybody in the data, but you also have high confidence that your data is comprehensive, right? You're not leaving a stone unturned, so to speak, that your numbers really are representative of people experiencing homelessness in your system. So I think we just wanted to drive home here that it's not a guarantee of accuracy when you have good data reliability, but it is saying that you have robust data management practices in place that are tracking things consistently. And so you can have reliable data, right? You could have 0% data reliability, but that could still mean that you're missing people in your system. So it's those two that work together that really get to quality data. And just so a little review of how we calculate data reliability, we use percentages to do that. And so this is very much, we always go back to that good analogy of balancing a checking account. It might be a little bit outdated right now, but it's still a great analogy. We use two separate ways to get to the same number. And if they're off, then that means we're not accounting for somebody in our process. So let's just look at a real example, right? If I'm looking at the data reliability percentage for December, I see that this community has reported 112 people as actively homeless. And that's my actual number. That's that monthly ending balance, so to speak. The second way I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at the previous month's ending balance, so to speak, or actively homeless reported number, and that's 109. And then I look at the inflow and outflow that occurs over the course of the month of December, and I see that there's a net change of 4. So I would expect that there's 4 less people reported at the end of the month for December. And I see that these are both off. And if they don't match, that means our data reliability is off. And so just framing it in a different way, think of the monthly data reliability as kind of like a margin of error, right? The closer to 0 you are, the more balanced your data is, the more confidence that you can say that you are accounting for everybody in all of your inflow and outflow categories, and they're all being accounted for in your actively homeless number. So just understanding a little bit more about like how we're calculating that percentage, we take that actual and compare it against the expected, and then we divide it over that actual number to get an actual percentage. And my math is off. I forgot to update the slide, so sorry about that. Okay, and then I'm going to hand it back to Lauren to talk a little bit more about framing the all singles.
All right, thank you, Jane. So before I dive in here, a couple of housekeeping notes that I wanted to set at the beginning of the session and totally escaped my mind as I started going into it. I made a point about this session generating more questions than answers, and that's pretty typical of any conversation about data. So I have a number of my teammates from Built for Zero data team on this call as well. And as you think of questions and as we get going, especially in these next couple sessions, because they are going to be where the bulk of the questions get generated, I'm going to encourage you to chat them in. What we're doing is we are actually copying and pasting them into a document that we're going to use sort of as a question bank to synthesize and really start kind of helping bridge more of a coaching strategy around helping you all really think about your data infrastructure system. So just wanted to note that piece. And more importantly, in the data team slide, I totally forgot to highlight that we do not have a bird mascot that sits on our team. That is actually representative of one of our newest data team members. His name is Elliot, and we are super excited. And when I reached out to him this morning to see if he had a picture that I could include in the slide, he regrettably said that he did not have any great pictures of himself, but that I was more than welcome to use his bird picture. So thank you, Elliot. And I just wanted to clarify that because I did see a couple people note that in I think Caitlin, you caught that, so I appreciate that. So, all right, back to it. So thinking about all singles and doing this data deep dive, we have to start with why. So why is it important? We heard a lot about this yesterday between Beth and Richard Chow's presentations. And I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was when Richard shared the graph that he shared during his talk. And it was the trend lines of point in time, the sums of point in time count data over the past couple of years. And what struck me and stood out to me immediately, like within the first couple seconds of looking at that chart, was seeing, the veterans and the families and those trend lines moving down over the years. And we know that we've documented that progress. A lot of us have been involved in that work and deeply proud of the reductions that we've made. But I noted that during those same time periods, what we saw with the sort of all singles of population or the adult homelessness was starting to tick up. And that's really why. I mean, ending a single adult homelessness is the next critical horizon in our collective work. And we know that we can do it because we've done it before with other subpopulations. So again, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? The all singles really is critical to helping us capture that broader and more accurate picture of the community's active adult population. It's important. We've heard some really good reflections to why it's critical for tracking those population changes. I know our friends from Gulf Coast and Fairfax shared some of their insights from expanding to their all singles work yesterday as well. And then when we're thinking about learning systems and work around quality improvement, what we've learned and sort of leaned into is this notion that it's really hard to isolate QI improvements to just veterans or to just your chronic, and that we needed to shift to that broader adult singles system so that we really could focus in on the larger system improvements that need to happen in order to support and carry the work forward. All right, so thinking about some of the reasons why the work is hard, we're just going to name it. By name list data is different than HMIS data. This isn't meant to pin either one against each other because they are both really great sources of information. But by name list data is just different in nature. It's about dynamically tracking people as they move through our systems. Whereas HMIS, it's geared more towards that system administration and program performance. It's structured, or it structures data collection by project type and funding sources, where then each participating agency sort of has a portfolio of projects or programs that they utilize to monitor and assess their client level program activity. It's really used heavily for compliance and grant reporting and has helped streamline those procedures and making it easier for communities to report back their program outcomes to their funders, which again has resulted in continuation of funding sources as we move along. And it has moved into an area of measuring system performance in the sense that it's looking at your entire context within your HMIS data set. So we are gleaning very valuable insights from there, but it's still very different from what we're trying to do with by name list data. By name list data sets, I said this before, but they're more dynamic. And it's really because they require a people management. It's really a physical list that your by name list data should be reported from. And honestly, it's really HMIS plus another data source. We know from our work with the VA that our work with our veterans that this was highlighted years ago, that oftentimes we're using data from HMIS and data from homes. The VA and HUD have done a tremendous amount of work to align their data standards and has made it much easier to share data. And that's really exciting and a huge step forward. But there are some situations in some communities that still don't have that VA data living within their HMIS systems. We also have to think about the DV, the domestic violence population, and those that aren't consenting to being assessed or receiving services yet. There are other people that are touching our systems that aren't just ready to be in HMIS, and that's okay. We still need to work to track them though. So where do we go from there? And really thinking about using data integrations and how do we incorporate larger amounts of data sources into one streamlined by name list data set. And I think we've been doing a lot of exploratory work in our system-wide quality data cohort, in our healthcare pilot work. There's a lot of communities that are really stretching the limits on kind of looking at their all single data through that and integrating with their healthcare systems. And then we have, just thinking beyond that and looking into inflow and tracking some of the other systems that we're going to need to interact with, because we know that there are sources of where our homeless population is flowing in from. The other piece I want to note here is this difference between HUD data quality versus by name list quality data. So really the highlight here is the mechanics of how your community manages by name list data and the nature of real-time data is different from HUD's data quality standards. HUD data quality is measuring that completeness, timeliness, and accuracy on the universal and program-specific data elements, looking at sort of by program, by agency, and then kind of a system-wide view. Your by name list data quality or quality data is measuring those things, but it's also measuring that reliability. So it's the reliability of real time. Is it balancing? Everything that Jane just kind of illustrated for us, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about a by name list quality data versus HMIS's data quality. All right, so in the spirit of using data for improvement, part of the prep for thinking about how we're going to talk about diving into the all singles data was really taking a look at the data that we had available to us, right? So to date, 64 communities have interacted and taken the all singles scorecard. So what Jane and I did was we went in and just took a look at the response rates for the data infrastructure section. So this is section 3 of the current scorecard. And as you can see, you know, of 64 out of 64 communities can track, you know, a lot of that population status data. You know, we do pretty good until we get down to the bottom. And that last line here is 49 out of 64 communities. If you take a look at what those actual questions are asking, they're asking if your by name list has the ability to track people through the system. Can it track the changes that happen and occur during a person's journey through their by name list? And that's the piece that's critical when we think about expanding the work, because we're going to be able to now better and more precisely track those changes between the different subpopulation profiles. All right, leaning into this, I'm going to do my best to illustrate this. All right, so if your community previously only reported on your veteran population or your chronic population, the changes that you were tracking at that point were veterans timing into chronic homelessness. Or depending on your process for adding veterans to your by name list, maybe you had veterans who were not actually veterans and you needed to track them in a different list. And that's expanding to your all singles. So it means that your community is now has the ability to track single adults who may not initially identify as a veteran, but after getting assessed are now considered a veteran. So they need to actually move on to your veterans list in order for you to track them. Same thing happens with a single adult who's timing into chronicity. We need to understand where our inflow into chronic is coming from. And part of it is coming from those single adults who are timing into that. This is the adult system. So moving beyond, once you get to a point where you can add in families or you can add in youth, your community can then start to track those that are aging out of the youth population into your single adult population, or tracking youth or families that may unfortunately split up and maybe somebody enters the adult single list and the others go to the youth list, or a youth that became a parenting youth and moves on to the family list, or maybe they're reunited with their family. Or you might have families that are youth that are timing into chronicity, or single adults that become parents or join a family household. What this slide is representing and what I'm trying to illustrate here is just how dynamic the data that we're working with is, because it is representative of the people that we're working with. So, in thinking about the use of dynamic data points, we're going to talk, Jane. Oh, give us 1 second. We may have had a little bit of a glitch. It looks like we popped out of our screen share. There we go. Thank you. Okay. So, what type of data fields? When we think about a by name list, it actually comprises of kind of 2 main buckets. So we have static data points. These are data points that generally will not change for most individuals. We have dynamic data points. And these are the elements that really help, that are more fluid in nature. So they're really designed to help us track information and that system flow. So in most communities, you know, HMIS can be used as a primary data source. However, it's likely that you'll need HMIS plus at least one other data source. If you don't have HMIS in your community, or maybe you just haven't been able to access it, one of the things that I would suggest is consider looking at HUD's data standards. They have forms, they have data collection tools, they have everything that you need that you would be able to organize your data sets in a structured manner that's already sort of that can easily be used with other data sets. It's just a really good way to organize your data. Adding in race and ethnicity is critical to helping us really dive into our racial equity work. You know, we don't know what we don't know, and until we really start looking at the disparities in our systems, we won't truly know how we can influence and change those outcomes so that there is equity across our programs and across access to the critical resources that we have available. I want to note too for static that I actually have date of ID and the date that somebody's added to the list, because I want to highlight that this actually should be a static data point. You should be able to capture like an historical moment of when somebody was new to your system or really new to your by name list data system. You want to be able to reflect back on that, because as you move into dynamic data points, that's really where you would start tracking your inactive and your returns. And all of those are going to generate new dates. We're not going to spend a ton of time right now on the dynamic data points because Jane is really going to dive into a lot of content around that in just a moment. But before we get there, and before we go down into that more tactical mindset, I just want to remind everyone that we're not doing the digging here during this call to find that one solution fits all light bulb moment, because it just isn't going to exist. Our systems look different, our communities are different, the ways that we interact with data are different, and we're all on a, you know, the spectrum of where we are in terms of our abilities to analyze and measure these data sets. Some of us are going to be, you know, at the start, some of us are paving the way for others, and we're going to lean on you heavily to help us understand and unlock some of the system barriers that we've identified for those that are just getting going. So stay curious. In this next section, really give some deep thoughts to, you know, these two questions. Like, what do we need to collect to answer our current questions? And what do we want to know down the road? So what are we going to have to start collecting in order to bridge those gaps in our analysis right now? So I'm going to hand it back over to Jane, who's going to really dive into the nuts and bolts of our systems.
All right, so just to preview, this will be very much in the weeds. So I apologize in advance, but we wanted to go really deep for communities that are expanding their reporting infrastructure to include all singles and beyond. So I think I first wanted to just start with what might be good data points to include on your by name list data set. And it's just understanding this is a starting point, right? You might have many, many more columns. In fact, many of you do, to be able to track people through the system, and also to track, you know, if the referrals, the warm handoffs, everything like that. But just understanding these are main data points that you will want to collect, and you might call them different things too, in order to be able to track people through your system effectively. And we'll talk a little bit more about these. So I'm just flagging that this is just a sample. Your list obviously will probably include way more and might have different names for these headers. Before we start talking about each of those components, I wanted to kind of share with you some reflections that Lauren and I have learned and insights we have made over the course of the past year in having the honor of data coaching communities that are in Built for Zero and just being thought partners. So one theme that I wanted to surface is there's two approaches that we're seeing communities use when they're pulling data for their by name list from HMIS. So one is we're calling casting the net wide, right? So that would be an example of a community that pulls pretty much all of their information from all programs out of HMIS. So it could be emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, everything, right? And when they do that, they, you know, everybody that's been entered into the system that has an active program enrollment, everyone will be included in that. There's also, on the other hand, a different approach, which is we see some communities where they funnel that information through one program enrollment, and they are able to pull just that data from that one program in HMIS. So it could be like a setup as a coordinated entry program enrollment, or another custom one that they might have built out. And we also see communities that kind of fall in the middle as well. So they might have set up like 3 coordinated entry programs, one for each of the major populations, like one for family, one for youth, one for single adults. So I think in framing this conversation, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what the implications of each of those choices could be, and how the data is pulled out of the system, and how you might think about structuring your data to be able to track people as they come through your system. So let's actually just take a scenario of someone coming through your system and look at how the two different ways are, how the implications of the two different ways show up. So let's take that example of casting the net wide, right? So let's say you have a person that comes into your system, right? And they might first enter through an emergency shelter. Then maybe at the emergency shelter, there's an outreach worker or navigator that connects them with a coordinated entry system. Then during that time, maybe while they're waiting for a referral to happen, waiting for paperwork to come through, they might exit back to the streets. And then maybe they're still engaged with that system, right? So they're referred to a housing program at that point. And then maybe they get accepted by that housing program and soon after are housed. So they physically move in. So notice we actually have that orange, the green, and the blue, and those each represent a single program enrollment in HMIS. So you already have 3 separate program enrollments right now. And maybe when they move in, you guys have a business rule that says they will exit the coordinated entry program enrollment at that time. But that person might actually stay open in that housing program enrollment because there might be wraparound services to make sure they're self-sufficient before they're closed out. So they're closed out after the fact, right? So you have a series of 3 program entries, and you have to have reporting logic that really points to which one are you looking at to demarcate like their date of identification and when you're counting them as inflow, right? But you also have 3 separate program exits, and really the one you're looking at is the date that they moved into housing to denote when they're actually going to be counted as outflow. And then across all these program entries and exits, the time between that date of identification and housing placement, that person, it continues to be counted as actively homeless. So there's a lot of complexity involved, right, in trying to build in reporting logic to sift through which of these am I looking at. So let's kind of use that same example and take a look at the by-name list data if it's more of a streamlined approach. So the same scenario, right? Enters emergency shelter, connects with coordinated entry. So the difference here is that I'm looking at the data from 1 program enrollment instead of 3. So it's a lot clearer, right? Like when a program, when that program enrollment opens, I might need to figure out how to, if there's a possibility they connected or engaged with the system prior to their coordinated entry enrollment, I might need to figure out a way to look back at when that actual date that they first became engaged with the system is to count the inflow. But it's pretty straightforward to understand, like, okay, when they exited, that is when they count as outflow, and that's when their housing placement occurred. And then the dates between the program enrollment and the program exit, that's when the actively homeless number is counted. So it's a lot easier to sift through that information. Okay, so I just wanted to cover that prior to kind of going over to some of those components as we kind of walk through this. So going back to that list of core components you might want to include on your by-name list data set, Obviously, you want a unique identifier to be able to track everybody as they come through your system. And if you're pulling it from HMIS, maybe you're just using that personal ID, right? That universal data element 5.08. But for those that haven't consented to being assessed or haven't consented to being put into HMIS, like how might you guys choose to solve for that? So they're tracked. For those that are fleeing from domestic violence, or for those that are in more protected populations, how might you work with that? Okay, so the next component is really just understanding like what is this person's current status on the list, right? Are they active? Do we still need to work on referring them to services? Are they already housed? Are they inactive? And pointing back to what Lauren was talking about, that is the crux of the whole by name list, right? Like you want to know exactly at a point in time on demand, like where is this person in the process? And do we still need to put them, refer them out to services? So there's 4 dates that are really key to tracking this to understand where a person or household status is. And ideally, again, pointing back to some of what Lauren had mentioned before, you want to be able to reconstruct the timeline of when a person came on and off your list and how, right? Were they exit to house? Were they returning back from inactive or were they returning back from housed? And just being able to track that history going back in time. So, you know, staying away from like if any date fields are overwritten or things like that is helpful for that. All right, so let's talk specifically about that date of identification. If you do use HMIS, you might choose to use a project start date, but remember, if you're casting the net wide, are you pointing to the right program start date to capture that date of identification? Housing move-in dates, those should be pretty straightforward, right? So it's that date of move-in. Or, you know, communities might choose to use a combination of a project exit date and an exit destination to a housed situation. But if you do that, is there a clear crosswalk between like those HUD exit destinations that, you know, that count towards your housed number? And is it clearly documented for reference so everyone's on the same page? And then for those that are enrolled in several programs at once, and if they do collect that housing move-in date, and they're not the same, like how do you solve for that, right? So thinking about that inactive date, you might choose to use project exit date in combination with an exit destination, right? You might have like no exit interview completed or something like that. But then think about if you cast the net wide and you have several program exits, which ones are the ones that you're looking at to designate if a client is marked in or moved off the list to inactive, right? And then just making sure that your inactive policy, as it's enforced, that's also reflected in the data collection process, right? So like if a client should be moved to inactive, is it showing up in the data consistently? And then again, with that casting the net wide, like we talked about, making sure that's pointing to the right exit to understand when that client should actually be counted as inactive. Sorry, I keep using the word client because in Jacksonville, we used client track. So that's just how we designated a person or household. Okay, and that last one obviously is really important. Again, you might choose to use a combination of a project start date and then with a previous exit off the list and a prior exit destination. And so just driving that point home of, are you able to track those historical returns on and off your list? And staying away from like overwriting versus actually capturing each date status as it's stored or as it's collected, so you can look back in time and be able to reconstruct when someone came in or on and off of your list. So this is just one example of a community that we were working with that they use the program exit destinations to map to certain by name list statuses. And so they actually went through and mapped out clearly, like, here's the ones that we're counting for house, here's the ones for inactive, and here's the ones for no longer meets criteria. I know this is very HMIS heavy, but that's just really to get you thinking of, if you do choose to use HMIS, these are some ideas. We're not trying to get prescriptive about mapping this exit to this by name list status. So I just wanted to give an example. All right, so that next component we're really looking at are those fields to be able to track those population status changes and making sure that you're able to track each of them as they occur, and like if they can be, if you can have more than one status applied at the same time. Right, so you might choose to have a household type where you can determine if someone's single, adult, population, family, and youth. And then you might also choose to have like a chronic status of yes or no, or a veteran status of yes or no. So just to dig a little bit deeper, I think when we looked at some of those stuck points for communities in determining, the scorecard, flipping those to yeses on the data infrastructure questions and tracking those population statuses, I think one of the reasons the household type one is super tricky is because there isn't necessarily like a global household type that's collected. So it's a static point, right? Data point. It's determined at every program enrollment. So it's who's enrolling with that head of house into this program. And so it's not clearly defined. So when you think about this, you might choose to like include a date of birth onto your by name list, or have a date diff function of some sort to determine age. And then you can use that relationship to head of household data fields that's collected at program entry to understand or be able to categorize which household type this person belongs in. If you have access to it, which I'm not sure people do, being able to get access to those metadata elements can be helpful, because you can be able to track a household as they were first enrolled into the system, but understanding that that's not always the case. I added in here the global household ID because some HMIS vendors might have that added. It's not a required field or anything per HUD, but it is that static household type that's pinpointed that tracks across no matter how that person shows up and enrolls in programs in HMIS. So if you do notice that there's a lot of variation in terms of how like one person might show up to a program, and like maybe they're enrolling with like just the adults for this one, and then they might enroll with their kids for this one, and it's hard to keep tracking that status, maybe something to think about is using an anchor program, right? So like maybe it's when they hit that coordinated entry assessment that you assess what are their housing goals during that specific episode. What are their housing goals as far as getting housed, like as a household, right? So like, do you include all of those people? And like that is a more static point, which can change obviously, but that might just be a little easier than trying to track it every time they enroll into a different program and show up differently in the system. So just a note about this piece, when it shows up in Built for Zero reporting metrics, if someone were to exit from that population because they no longer met it, so like if there was a youth that timed into being a single adult, they would come off the youth list as no longer meets population criteria in an outflow category, but they would also get included as inflow and under newly identified in the single adult list. So just that's how that mechanism would work to make sure like your data stays balanced over time. Okay, and then I spent a lot of months figuring out the chronic status of, or trying to figure out how to pull that information out of HMIS. So I'd love to be thought partners with you guys in the future on this, but you know, just being able to pull that information out of HMIS can be helpful. And obviously veteran status. The last component I think points to what Lauren was saying about how if you want to use data for improvement, you want to begin with the end in mind and be able to think about what ways might be helpful for a community to meaningfully understand their data, right? So if you want to disaggregate and look for potential I'm losing the word, but like if you're trying to look for disproportionality in different subpopulations, you'll want to be able to drill down in your data and include some of these other fields like gender, race, ethnicity. And I think that's really important to add. So that all to say, like when we're talking about your by name list, we're really talking about a universe of data, right? It's a by name list data set. And it's a data set that you can pull not only a list of people that are actively homeless that you would like to case conference by subpopulation or population, right? But you also are able to pull your monthly Built for Zero metrics from. You're also able to look back in time and look at, you know, like the historical view of the system, right? And finally, you want to be able to disaggregate in meaningful ways to look at disparities over time. But for example, if you're like overwriting information or dates, it's going to be hard to do that. So think about how you might set up your data infrastructure so it enables you to do all of that. Okay, sorry. I know I went a lot in the weeds. We're gonna bring it back up and zoom back out. I'm gonna pass this back over to Lauren, who's gonna help us frame out how to get started in this process.
All right, thanks, Jane. Yeah, so I was scrolling through the chat and I'm just so excited to dive into that because I think there's some really good conversations starting, and it's just personally, one of my most favorite things about the Built for Zero movement is this collective nature of just sharing knowledge and sharing each other's, you know, interpretations of the ways that they're doing things. So thank you all for your thoughts and your, you know, offerings in the chat so far to date. And I know it's been a lot of info, and we're gonna continue to help you guys chunk this down in bits and pieces as we work together over the next couple of months. You know, Jane and I are really framing this as here is the start of the work. The data team, the Built for Zero data team itself is really diving into this and thinking about what improvements can we make to the scorecard itself? What improvements can we make to the infrastructure and the way that you are reporting data to us? You know, all these things, how can we help you guys figure out how to access and build out these dynamic by name lists in a more streamlined tech-enabled way? I mean, these are all things that we're going to be really diving into over the next couple weeks and couple months, especially as we get into the summertime. And really, it is us also learning from you and, you know, learning from each other and really, you know, building the momentum so we all have confidence moving forward that we can do this work. And that really is what makes the Built for Zero movement unstoppable. So expanding the scope, where to start, just start. You know, I think the important thing here is that if you haven't had a chance to take the all single scorecard, think about getting your team together to do so soon. There's no risk to losing your current quality data status for any of the subpopulation profiles that you're actively working on. And I'd like to note too that through our work with some of the communities in the system-wide quality data cohort, and again with our work with the communities in the healthcare pilot, a lot of communities are already actually pooling and assessing their all single adult population data. We're just, building upon that momentum and really getting sharper with the ways that we're looking at it. And again, I'm going to reiterate this point. Start where you can and use that data for improvement. As we work on expanding our by name list data sets and data infrastructures, expect to see fluctuations in your monthly active homeless numbers. For those of us who've been in this work and communities who have been involved since really the 100,000 homes days, we know how much our numbers can fluctuate as we're adding people into the system. And I think the frame here is, it's not about, oh my goodness, our numbers are spiking, because it's not really saying like we have more people who are homeless than we did before. This is really about our system getting more representative, being more inclusive, and including everyone that we need to be taking an account for. So it can be a lot to take in. And where do you get started? And sometimes you just have to, get outside of your head and shift into this notion of system mapping. This is actually the system map from Jacksonville's coordinated entry system circa 2015. And I have this up here because I think it's important to note that, as I was listening to Jake's keynote, as Beth reminded us so many times of our lessons from failing forward and how it has helped us really improve the work and gain better insights into our data, and all those moments have stuck with me, and I can't help but circle back to all the work that the communities such as Jacksonville have done, and some of my friends that have worked in Metro Denver, that have worked in Detroit, that have worked in, Fremont, Colorado. Like, there are so many people out here that have done this thing over and over again. And really, it's going back to this notion of system mapping. This is a great way to just get it out of your head. It helps you visualize your system in ways that you just can't do when you're looking at spreadsheets, and you just can't do adequately when you're thinking about, how do I track, where are the points that we're collecting the information that I need? This is a really good process. And it's important because it helps sort of leverage those opportunities. If you want to go to the next slide, Jane. It helps leverage the opportunities to build your HMIS capacity. It gives everyone a map of how the data is collected, shared, and used within your local infrastructure. And it allows you to establish and implement by name list data management policies and procedures. And that's critical to the work that we're doing because of the nature of the by name list data sets that we're working with. And again, I think the biggest piece here is, there is nothing more detrimental to a community's progress than having a person who is doing all your reporting and knows the process, knows how to pull those reports, leaving that position and not having anyone to step in that knows how to do that. So having to retrain, having somebody needing to essentially recreate the process, it really is a momentum killer. So we want to be able to start building the bench and documenting these processes so we can have that continuity no matter what happens within our staffing. We can survive those major staffing changes, and we thrive on them because that's really how we grow and develop the people that are working within our own agencies. All right, a couple of things before we wrap up. So, in thinking about data management, we really need to think about how it needs to be comprehensive and really sort of tracking and pulling all these different pieces together. So I want to take you through this chart, and I may actually tag Jane in for a little bit of this conversation to help me because she has color coded this. And so if we think about the pieces, so we want to establish business data collection rules. When somebody becomes inactive, how does that show up in the data? What do we do with the move-in dates? How do we essentially start organizing and structuring the data so that we can get ready to implement our metrics? And this could be, a shared process. It might live within your coordinated entry. It might live within your actual HMIS admin responsibilities and duties. Training end users, time and time again, so much time was spent with the HMIS data team in just going out and meeting with our end users, helping them understand, training and retraining until really everyone felt confident in the process and understood their role in it. They understood the value that they were adding to the data, so our data started to improve. Thinking about monitoring, and again, it's just really looking for that data completeness. Are we capturing all the data? Is it captured consistently? Are we able to incorporate into our larger data set in a meaningful and efficient way that isn't disruptive to the rest of the flow? Thinking about process, again, this is really where you need to, or I'm sorry, thinking about the reporting logic. This is really where you need to double down on documenting the steps. You need to leave a roadmap for somebody who's going to step into that role so they feel confident in, all right, I can pick this ball up and run with it. And that kind of ties into process a little bit. You know, you want to be able to establish, you know, those policies and procedures, both that govern the data work that you're doing, but also give everyone else, again, that roadmap to how do I interact with you? How do I enter your system, and how are you tracking me through it? So this list isn't exhaustive, and you know, there's components here that work together, there's components that stand alone. Again, this is just meant to sort of throw this out here as work that we're going to be pushing you and working with you on in the next, you know, months to come. All right, you know, we have just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. One of the biggest things I think I spent probably the most time on in my role in Jacksonville and in my role now with the Built for Zero data team is helping to reframe challenges as opportunities. So when we think of low provider participation, expanding to the all singles data set really is, it opens up more inclusive opportunities. Maybe that person or that agency felt left out because it wasn't a priority focus that we were working on before. It brings people to the table. Data quality issue is just opportunities for more direct system training. And again, those inaccessible systems, so we need data from here, but we don't have a way to get it, is an opportunity to strengthen your governance around your data sharing and how your community is working with your data sets. All right. Last minute to go. I can't believe that we actually made it almost on time. So if you're interested in getting support for all single scorecard, we're going to encourage you to reach out and talk with your cohort leads for the different interventions that you're going to be a part of through the summer. If you're thinking about going system wide and really just diving into pulling all of your population level data, we can refer you to Julia Partial, who is getting ready to get the next cohort up and running down the road. And again, if you're interested in potential data supports for your community work, please reach out to the Built for Zero data team at the following email address. You know, we'll triage and the appropriate person will get back to you. And finally, before you sign off, if you can, please, I know we spent a lot of time talking at you today, but we are very interested in your feedback. We're very interested in having more conversations with you together as we go through and really do this thing. So please take a couple moments to give Jane and I some feedback on our session today. And with that, we thank you very much. I know a lot of you have stayed with us till the end here, and we really appreciate it and look forward to working with you. So here we go.